Today in Pakistan, a religious leader of a political party, which is also a religious party, issued death threats to the Chief Justice of Pakistan for issuing an order in a blasphemy case. Now, there is a debate going on in Pakistan that the person should be arrested, there should be a case against that person, and so on and so forth. To understand about the context in which this death threat took place, this kind of politics takes place, is important. And to understand it, I have with me Mary Hunter. Mary did her PhD from University of St. Andrews, and her thesis was on contextualizing Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization of Pakistan, 1977 to 1988, and its impact on non-Muslims in the thought of Maududi and British colonialism, which is very fascinating. You can see from the title, she's coming up with something very unique and very intriguing. That there is something to do with Maududi's thought, there is something to do with colonialism, and of course, Zia's own politics and its background. We will talk about this research, her findings, arguments in detail. First of all, Mary, congratulations on your PhD.
Thank you so much, Farah, and thank you for having me on your podcast today.
Thank you. So my first question, what was your puzzle? Why? Because there has been so much work on Zia and his Islamization and colonialism. So what was your puzzle, and why you decided to do and to pursue that puzzle?
Yeah, so I think the puzzle was definitely something that kind of changed over time with the development of my research topic. So in the beginning, when I first pitched for and applied to doing the PhD, it was mainly focusing on Islamic fundamentalism in the context of the Zia regime and trying to kind of problematize that term and maybe come up with a different term to kind of refer to the sort of movements that would emerge into some of the extremist groups that we see in Pakistan today. And this was primarily like an offshoot of my undergraduate dissertation, which, having been kind of trained in theology at university, I did my undergraduate dissertation on Tehreek Taliban Pakistan, TTP, and focused on arguing that their actions and statements didn't cohere with the Quran. So it was mainly to try and kind of problematize the Western media portrayals of Islam as inherently violent and the association of the religion with terrorism. So obviously, having studied that, a lot of those issues kind of stemmed from the Zia period, especially in relation to Afghanistan and the Mujahideen and how that grew into the Taliban in Afghanistan and later in Pakistan as well. But ultimately, because, as you say, a lot has been said about the Zia regime in relation to Afghanistan, in relation to Saudi Arabia, in the context of the Zia regime, I sort of decided to look at kind of a more domestic issue, more like looking at the Islamization of Pakistan from a kind of inward-looking perspective to kind of focus on the development of a national identity and an ideology. So that's how the puzzle kind of like changed over the course of the literature review and the research. But ultimately, I decided on and found kind of three main gaps in the literature that I sought to kind of fill through my doctoral thesis. So the first is I found that those who had written on Zia's Islamization, whether focusing on it as a comprehensive process or on specific aspects of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I really like it. So before you explain the research gaps, a quick question. So was that puzzle actually reflective of continuation of the Zia's Islamization that manifested itself through Taliban, TTP? So was there any connection that triggered the new kind of thought, or the TTP was an entirely new thing? But to say in a different way, is or was TTP a continuation of Zia's Islamization, or you found TTP a little bit different and Zia's Islamization was different?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they were necessarily the same sort of thing. I was mainly kind of suggesting that because a lot of the problems to do with kind of violence and extremism and relating to religion kind of stemmed from the Zia era, although that was more specifically in terms of the Taliban that was in Afghanistan. But I think the reason why I kind of shifted away from the TTP into this area was mainly because we've kind of generally Pakistan studies have focused on Pakistan through the kind of security lens most of all, especially people who aren't Pakistani. So I kind of wanted to shift away from that sort of focus on Pakistan and more towards maybe looking at it from a theological lens. And then I thought that, this Islamization process was a natural, topic to kind of focus on in that respect.
And this is very fascinating. Just to share with the audience, with the viewers, that you study theology, right? You study religion.
Yes.
When I study political science, you are absolutely spot on when you say that the studies generally were, particularly after the 9/11, from the security lens. And the overall idea was, even in political science and international relations, that one, Islam, second, Muslim societies are a problem that needs to be fixed. So taking a theological approach to understand a religious question is fascinating and intriguing. This is just my comment on your approach.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot to be taken away from it. I think generally people view theology in sort of a negative way, that it can be quite impractical because it's focusing on quite niche issues that many won't see as affecting their kind of day-to-day life. But ultimately, in the context of Pakistan, Islam is so important and it's intimately connected with kind of every aspect of society. So it seems like a natural place to kind of look and understand the sort of issues that are affecting, the kind of role of religion in the state and the relationship between religious communities.
Okay, now I will let you complete. So you found 3 research gaps. So please carry on.
Yeah, so as I was saying, the first was that those who had written on Zia's Islamization of Pakistan didn't really have theological backgrounds, and this is what we were just talking about. So like yourself, they were often political scientists or historians, legal experts, and social scientists. So this isn't a criticism from my point of view, being from a different discipline, but I learned a lot from them. But I kind of felt that theological approach could kind of complement the analysis that they've already provided, whether they were talking about Islamization as a comprehensive process or like focusing on specific legislation. And people have often talked about particularly women in the context of Islamization. So the second gap in that respect is that much of the literature didn't focus specifically on the ongoing and far-reaching impact on religious minorities of Zia's Islamization. So that became kind of the central focus of my thesis. And then the third is that those who do look at the place of religious minorities in Pakistan don't really account for the ideological and theological influence played by Maududi in terms of the perceptions of religious minorities and kind of what their rights should be in Pakistan. So ultimately, unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of the talk about Pakistan in the modern day is about the situation facing religious minorities. So the significance, I think, of my thesis is trying to unpick the kind of development of this modern day antipathy and violence that we see towards religious minorities, with a specific focus on the pivotal amendments that were made through Zia's Islamization, and how this was kind of influenced by other people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I do agree with you on this point that the situation of minorities in Pakistan is not very ideal. And talking about a historical context which actually shaped the cultural discourse, I would say, apart from the legal institutions and legal discourses, it actually imposed a cultural discourse that continues to marginalize and in some ways threaten the existence of minorities, and particularly religious minorities in Pakistan. So it's very important, and I think it's very timely too. So thank you so much for doing research on this. Now, you argue that you make 4 arguments in this study. in response to these research gaps. Tell me briefly, what are those 4 arguments?
Sure. So there are 4 seminal arguments that I tried to make throughout the thesis. The first one is in applying Louis Althusser's theory of ideology. I argue that Zia constructed an Islamic ideology of Pakistan, and he sought to realize it through the Islamization process. And I've kind of piggybacked on the back of scholars who have also suggested that Islamization under Zia was kind of a top-down process. So ultimately, Zia was trying to associate his Islamic ideology and the Islamization process with the basis upon which Pakistan was created, including by associating this ideology with Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and this is something that I tried to problematize. The second kind of seminal argument.
So on the first argument, just a quick question, clarifying question. So you make a point that Zia, to some extent, constructed this Islamic ideology for his own political agenda. It was not the continuation of so-called Pakistan's ideology or the ideology of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Is this what you are trying to argue?
Yeah, so I'll probably get onto it a bit later as well. Basically, I would suggest that Jinnah himself had quite not always a consistent vision for what Pakistan would be. If you compare, say, the two-nation theory that he articulated at the time of the Lahore Resolution in 1940, or if you then turn to, say, the first presidential address he made to the Constituent Assembly in 1947, these are quite different visions of Pakistan. In the two-nation theory, he believed that Hindus and Muslims couldn't evolve a common nationality. And yet in the presidential address in 1947, he suggests that both communities kind of forget their differences and that they would ultimately cease to be Hindus and Muslims in the political sense as citizens of the state. So when we talk about the ideology on which Pakistan was created, I don't think we can clearly say what that ideology was, because even the founding father, was sometimes inconsistent about what that was. And Zia didn't exactly attempt to kind of clear that up, even in his opinion. And ultimately, Zia kind of disagreed with some of Jinnah's beliefs about, who was to be the sovereign in Pakistan. Jinnah believes the legislator should be sovereign, whereas Zia believed, as with the Objectives Resolution, that God should be sovereign. And obviously they disagreed over the extent that religious minorities should have religious freedom. So in my opinion, their views were quite different, and Zia's was ultimately more aligned with Maududi's, who himself opposed Jinnah and the Pakistan movement initially. So that's what I'd say probably on those issues.
Yeah, we will talk later about how Jamaat Islami historically has been trying to reconcile Maududi's historic opposition to Jinnah and his politics. This has been interesting. Anyways, so the second argument.
So the second argument is that Islamization can be better understood in the context of Maududi's theological ideas. So this is because steps taken towards Islamization were not always contextualized within a larger vision for Pakistan. So as we know, Maududi wrote many works. He formulated a comprehensive Islamic system of life. So when we take isolated steps towards Islamization, as Zia did, then we can't always understand their context in terms of their relationship with other steps and also in terms of the larger system. So I found that by reading Maududi's works in depth, then I could understand those steps within that kind of wider context.
Right. So, and in the second argument, you make a point that there is a link between Maududi's thought and Zia's politics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would say that because mostly scholars who have talked about Zia and Maududi in the context of Islamization, they're often put in opposition. So many would suggest that Zia obviously had a top-down process of Islamization, so that's enforcing, these sorts of legal amendments from above, whereas in most of Maududi's work, he suggested a bottom-up Islamization. So everything had to be changed to be Islamic in order for those, legal amendments and such to make sense. So they're often put at odds, but my suggestion was actually when you read more of their statements, sometimes Zia favors the bottom-up process and sometimes Maududi favors the top-down process. So I'd say that it's slightly more nuanced and complex than maybe other scholars had talked about before. But ultimately, obviously, Zia's actions prove that he opted for the top-down process.
Fascinating. Yep. You can move on to the third point.
Yeah, so the third one is that it wasn't only Maududi that had a significant influence on Zia's Islamization, it was also British colonial thought and practice. And this wasn't just in the one-dimensional sense that Zia was resisting colonialism rhetorically as kind of the reason why Islamization should occur in order to kind of redress those injustices of colonialism. But also in the sense that the Zia regime perpetuated colonial thought and practice, particularly through the maintenance and additions to offences relating to religion under the Pakistan Penal Code, which of course was originally the Indian Penal Code made by the British colonialists in pre-partition India.
Right. And the fourth one?
The fourth one is that Zia's Islamization did have a lasting impact on Pakistan's religious minorities. So I wouldn't say the spirit of that was entirely novel because Zia perpetuated kind of this ill-defined place of religious minorities, which I think was kind of apparent in the Objectives Resolution from 1949 onwards. But also because of his legal amendments and particularly the Ahmadiyya being criminalized and how the minorities continue to be disproportionately accused of offenses relating to religion.
Right. So thank you for summarizing. I have read your thesis and when you talk in detail and so thank you for summarizing so carefully. Now, you make these four arguments and they are interlinked, interconnected. What kind of evidence do you use to make these arguments?
Yeah, so just to talk specifically about methodology before I go into the specific evidence for each argument, a lot of my research involved looking initially at the statements of the Zia regime and the kind of changes that he made to the constitution and the laws. A lot of this is kind of available online nowadays, which is very useful, but you've also got the British Library, which contains a lot of documents from the Pakistan government historically. And then obviously, in order to kind of test some of the assertions about Maududis influence, I read all of his primary works in detail and also looked at, as my Urdu was getting better, then I was able to read some of his contemporary Urdu works as well to kind of at least check that the translations I was largely relying on were, as far as I could understand, correct. So that was good. So those were the kind of main ways in which I kind of approached the research methodologically. I don't know if you want to jump in there or I can carry on with the evidence of the argument.
You can carry on. You can carry on, yeah.
So the first, as I said, the first seminal argument is about Zia trying to realize this Islamic ideology through the Islamization process. So I chose Louis Althusser's theory of ideology, who kind of provided this revised Marxist conception of society, because it was quite a useful framework to deconstruct how Zia used everything at his disposal to kind of realize this ruling ideology, which in his words was an Islamic ideology of Pakistan that equated kind of patriotism with a desire to kind of enforce Islamic principles. So Althusser referred to dominant ideological state apparatus, which in which the ruling ideology would be realized. So this is separate in his understanding from the state apparatus, which was, the police, the courts, and the government. So the dominant ideological state apparatus in this context was, of course, the Islamic one, which extended its influence over other ideological state apparatuses, namely the legal, educational, cultural, familial, and communications. So I'll just summarize kind of the ways in which this occurred. So Zia sought to kind of realize this Islamic ideology in education by introducing a new educational policy in 1978 that kind of centered around Islam and the masjid. He also, from 1980 onwards, made Islamic and Pakistan studies compulsory at the bachelor's level at some universities, and he also ensured that the madrasa network was kind of rapidly expanded, though the figures about that expansion are kind of contested and range from hundreds to kind of thousands. And in terms of like the law, Zia reinvigorated the Council of Islamic Ideology, which still advises whether laws are repugnant to Islamic injunctions and recommends how to bring the laws into conformity with those injunctions. And he also established the Federal Sharia Court, and this was to determine on petition whether laws were un-Islamic and thus had to be replaced. And ultimately, this Islamic ideology would also prevail in the cultural ideological state apparatus, mainly through the Motion Pictures Ordinance of 1979. And this established boards to examine and certify films for public exhibition, without which a film couldn't be shown publicly. And two of the criteria for not certifying a film included if it was, and I quote, prejudicial to the glory of Islam or the integrity, security, or defense of Pakistan, end quote. And I think this is still used today to kind of prevent and censor some films from being shown. So those are the kind of primary ways in which I showed that Zia kind of used this dominant Islamic ideological state apparatus to influence education, the law, and culture in Pakistan. And he also used it in even more controversial ways, which was to kind of preserve his undemocratic rule. Firstly, through the 1984 referendum, the question of which equated the Islamization process with the preservation of the ideology of Pakistan. So he interpreted a positive response to that referendum as kind of legitimizing him, even though he'd assumed power through a coup. And secondly, he had postponed the elections of October 1977 because he was awaiting an environment in which, and I quote, the ideology of Pakistan should be in the forefront, end quote. Another example is his amendments to the Political Parties Act, and this meant that no political party could be formed that was prejudicial to the Islamic ideology of Pakistan, although again, without confirming exactly what this ideology was. And finally, one of the reasons why Zia dismissed Junaid's elected government in 1988 was because the integrity and ideology of Pakistan had been, in his view, seriously endangered. So, he used it to kind of extend influence over aspects of life which might be considered private affairs in the West, but obviously in this context were public. And he also used it to defend his kind of undemocratic rule in Pakistan. And as I kind of touched upon at the start, he associated all of this Islamization process and the Islamic ideology with the basis upon which Pakistan was created. And I think this helped him to legitimize it further, particularly, I think, in Pakistan, as with other countries, if you invoke someone who is as revered as Jinnah as supporting your ideas, then it's likely to gain some traction, whether or not it's true.
It's a highly political thing to do,
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, as I suggested earlier, I think this doesn't actually stand the test of, the fact of what Jinnah actually said. So I would, argue that his attempts to kind of legitimize it through association with Pakistan's creation kind of fall flat.
Right. So from this point, what I am getting very clearly is that, as you mentioned earlier, that Zia's Islamization was not just a top-down thing. There is more nuance to that. There is more complexity to that. So he was, for example, he was Islamizing laws and institutions. However, at the same time, he was also reforming, quote unquote, education, which means it was a collective approach to Islamize the state as well as society at the same time. And maybe one of the reasons that you mentioned in your last chapters, the continuity of the Zia's Islamization, is that not only state was Islamized, the society was to a greater extent was Islamized. So, like, this is the correct understanding of your idea?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think when Zia was kind of first introducing his Islamization plan, he talked about the enforcement of Islamization through the government, which is obviously the state's role in enforcing the laws, as we touched upon. But he also talked about the responsibility of each Muslim in Pakistan to become more Islamic. So he'd actually kind of suggested that Muslims in the West, young Muslims, were actually starting to turn against Islam because they saw the hypocrisy in Muslims in countries like Pakistan in not actually living according to the principles of Islam. So he would call on people to, pray more regularly. You've got the example of the Ramadan ordinance, which basically enabled people to, enforced really people having to, kind of stick to Ramadan by the closure of shops and cinemas and so on and so forth. So I think he was trying his best to kind of create all of those circumstances so that people would be more religious. But he did, appeal to the people to be kind of a part of that process. So that might be compared to the belief that Maududi had that ultimately changing laws here and there isn't going to make a difference. He believed that things like theft and poverty would be alleviated if an Islamic system exists, that you wouldn't need the laws, they would just be a deterrent, because in a utopian Islamic society, there wouldn't be poverty because everyone would give to charity, and people wouldn't steal things because they wouldn't have the need to do that, and they would be morally upright people. So I'd say that, it reflects that more broader approach to Islamization that he had, that I think sometimes people talk about less in the context of Islamization.
Right. Fascinating. And the second point that you make, you make a fascinating argument, and that Zia was to a greater extent influenced by Maududi's thought when he was doing the Islamization. And you actually did a very careful analysis of Maududi's pamphlets and then the laws made during the Zia's era.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand why it makes someone convinces, how it convinces someone that it was not per se the Pakistan's ideology or Jinnah's ideology that influenced Zia as he claimed. Rather, it was Maududi who actually shaped his thinking.
Yeah, so obviously I touched kind of arguments why I believe that comparisons between Jinnah and Zia ultimately fall flat and are unconvincing. And in terms of kind of Maududi's influence on Zia, there's a lot of kind of similarities and parallels there, and quite a few other scholars have kind of talked about the influence that Jamaat Islami had over Zia before he became before he kind of led the coup, and while he was kind of in charge of the army. But ultimately, both Zia and Maududi spoke of an Islamization. In Maududi's words, it was to Muslimize Pakistan, which he kind of referred to the kind of conversion of Pakistan to Islam. They also had kind of a comparable anti-colonial rationale for Islamization. So they perceived the problems of modernity as a symptom of a lack of faith in Islam, and this necessitated the Islamization process because they viewed Islam as a solution to all of these problems. In so doing, they kind of advocated for a return to Islamic principles and not necessarily at the expense of the positives of modernity. They also had similar views about introducing Islamic law, but it not leading to sectarianism. So in the context of the Zakat and Usher Ordinance in 1980, they both suggested, well, ultimately, all Islamic sects are agreed on the Islamic law when it comes to those taxes. And that because the Council of Islamic Ideology had signed off on it, which included a Shia member, that there was no way that Shias were going to respond negatively to it. Obviously, this proved to be very misguided, as I think it was about 10,000 Shias marched on Islamabad in response, and ultimately the Zia regime had to U-turn on that particular issue. So that kind of showed that ultimately Islamic law wasn't quite as simple as they perceived it was in that particular context. So I kind of focus more on kind of two primary examples of how Zia's Islamization can be better understood in the context of Maududi's ideas. So I don't necessarily suggest that Maududi was directly involved in all of these aspects. Some scholars have asserted that, but I kind of found the evidence a bit wanting. So the first particular issue that I focus on in this respect is the objectives resolution. So obviously people might be thinking, well, why are you talking about that in the context of Zia's Islamization? It was introduced in 1949, but it was under Zia that obviously it was made a substantive part of the constitution in 1985. And he also believed that it allowed Islam to occupy a pivotal position within the constitution, and he referred to it in his provisional constitution order of 1981 when the constitution had been suspended. So as I say, scholars have suggested that Maududi directly influenced the creation of the resolution, but they didn't actually provide concrete evidence for that. So I instead explored the theological similarities between Maududi's ideas and those of the resolution, which Zia, very much agreed with. And this was to kind of suggest that we can understand these ideas better in the context of his kind of works. So the Jamaat Islami would ultimately use the resolution to judge the progress of Islamization prior to Zia, as it affirms both that sovereignty in Pakistan belonged to God and that Muslims would be enabled to live according to Islamic teachings. Maududi's contemporary Urdu writings also state that he and his party were attempting to get the Constituent Assembly to declare certain fundamental statements that would render Pakistan's system an Islamic one, two of which were made through the resolution. That sovereignty belongs to God and that elected representatives are his agents, and that the state cannot transgress the limits of Islam. And this was actually used by Khurshid Ahmad, who is probably one of the main reasons why Maududi is known in the English-speaking world, because he translated all of Maududi's works and was a prominent member of the Jamaat Islami. And he had kind of argued that the fact that these declarations that Maududi made were in the resolution was evidence of Maududi's and Jamaat Islami's kind of influence over the objectives resolution. And then the second primary example to kind of show that Zia's Islamization can be better understood in the context of Maududi is, in this case, direct evidence to show that Maududi directly influenced the Zia regime. And this is in relation to the justification of the 1984 ordinance, which criminalized the Ahmadi. So the regime actually published a pamphlet entitled Qadiani's Threat to Islamic Solidarity, Measures to Prohibit Anti-Islamic Activities in 1985, long title, which you can find in the British Library. And this, I was reading it and I was thinking I'd read some of it before, and I knew for a fact I hadn't read it before. But it's because it plagiarizes Maududi's pamphlet, which I'd read beforehand, which is called The Qadiani Problem, which was written in 1979. And that's actually an English translation of the Urdu pamphlet that he wrote in 1953. So it has quite a...
I read that you were true, yeah.
Yeah, so actually, I think there's most of the Zia regime's pamphlet kind of copies Maududi's pamphlet, but without any acknowledgement. So the only
with or without copyrights.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was long before the protection of intellectual property, I guess, apparently. But so basically, the only kind of scholar that the Zia regime acknowledges really in that pamphlet is Iqbal, who in turn did greatly influence Maududi on the subject of the Ahmadiyya. But yeah, so obviously then I turned to kind of Maududi's wider anti-Ahmadi arguments to kind of understand the rationale that the Zia regime gave for the criminalization of the Ahmadiyya, and obviously his conception of an Islamic state which defines the rights and roles of non-Muslims within an Islamic state.
Interesting. So, a quick question: was Maududi or Jamaat Islami, were they deliberately giving this kind of legitimacy to the state, to Zia in this case, or was that just a coincidence that Zia used or misused Maududi's pamphlets or his thoughts for his political agenda? And the same question for the objective resolution: why was, to put it simply, Maududi so influential at that time?
So with regards to the first question, the Zia regime and the Jamaat Islami had quite a difficult relationship. Syed Vali Nazar has written kind of most kind of concretely on this issue. So ultimately, you know, the Jamaat Islami were involved in the Zia regime in the government, but that was before the 1984 ordinance. So there wasn't actually any members of the Jamaat Islami in the government at the time. And also, I think it was about 2 months or so before the ordinance that student unions were banned. And that was primarily because of the violence that the student wing of the Jamaat Islami had been engaging against the kind of left-wing student unions. So there was definitely a separation between the Zia regime and the Jamaat Islami on that kind of official level. I'd probably argue that the Zia regime didn't want to give too much credit to Maududi and to the Jamaat Islami. Obviously, Maududi had died in 1979, so that's partly why I think people would never think there was a connection between this pamphlet written in 1985, 6 years after he'd passed away. But I think because of Maududi having wanted power in Pakistan, having wanted to have that political influence, the Zia regime probably didn't want to apportion too much credit to the Jamaat Islami for influencing the rationale for this idea. So it was probably, I'd say, deliberate. I don't think the Zia regime accidentally plagiarized, Maududi. So obviously Maududi's ideas had a lot of credence in Pakistan, as they did kind of internationally through the Arabic and English translations of his works. So I think it was probably deliberate in that respect. And to do with the objectives resolution, I think the two primary ideologues that people associate with it are Maududi and Uthmani. So obviously Liaquat Ali Khan was the
Usmani, right?
Usmani, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know there was someone who started to do a bit of work on that recently. So I think there's a bit of toing and throwing over who kind of directly influenced the objectives resolution out of the two of them. I think someone has once suggested that it was Maududi's ideas through Usmani that influenced the objectives resolution. So there's a lot of kind of debate, and ultimately I think we can only really speculate about who it was that directly influenced it. So that's why I've tended towards the argument that it can at least be better understood in the context of Maududi's theological ideas. So yeah, I think obviously with Maududi and the Jamaat Islami, they never won a great deal of the vote in any elections. So some might suggest that they were influential in that respect. Maududi was never in power himself. So yeah, but I think because of the wide application and accessibility of his works, he became popular. I mean, I'm just learning, over the last few years to read Urdu. And yeah, I can understand his works fairly slowly, but I can understand them, which goes to show that, they're accessible compared to a lot of theological works, which would have been in Arabic. So firstly, they couldn't read it. And secondly, in very inaccessible language. So I think there was a certain accessibility to lay people that Maududi had, and hence that's why he could influence, a lot of people, including people who were, in power, such as Zia as well.
Perfect. Now, let's talk about this was my most favorite part of your research, Zia and colonialism. First, you make a point that Zia was resisting. At the same time, he was also using some kind of colonial, uh, I would say, discourse or structure for his own interests. Help me understand, like, what was the relationship of Zia's regime with colonialism?
Yeah, so obviously the most obvious one is that he, as I mentioned, resisted colonialism. So as I mentioned, in terms of the rationale for Islamization, Zia kind of attributed the socioeconomic injustices of the modern day to materialism, which in turn bred colonialism. So for him, it was Islam, with its emphasis on justice and tolerance, that these problems caused by materialism and colonialism could kind of be remedied. Islamization was presented as a response and a panacea to colonialism, effectively. So obviously, I'm not gonna say that he kind of outwardly celebrated British colonialism. He didn't do that, but there's a contradiction between his rhetoric as being anti-colonial and his actual actions in practicality. So Zia perpetuated colonial thought and practice through the Islamization process. And the three kind of main arguments I use are firstly that he took advantage of an undemocratic environment to make sweeping legal changes. So I compare this to the British in pre-partition India, in respect of them having codified the law into a single Indian penal code, all kind of by British architects, mainly Thomas Babington Macaulay. And it was eventually kind of established in 1860, and that was just after the First War of Independence, when India fell under British direct rule from the British Crown. So it's not as if the Indians had a say in what laws they would be made subject to, although the attempt was to make it look like it was a matter of equality for treating Europeans and Indians under the same laws. But ultimately, this is kind of comparable to what the regime did. I focus on offences relating to religion because of the connection to religious minorities. And 4 out of 5 of the offences added by Zia were made through ordinances. That was before the constitution was revived, before the elections. So it wasn't exactly a democratic move on his part. And as I mentioned, he repeatedly postponed elections. The second argument is that Zia, like his predecessors, maintains the colonial era Pakistan penal code, and even the sections he added, which are generally presented as kind of opposed to the colonial era sections because they only protect Islam and Muslims. They actually use that colonial era language of hurt religious feelings. So sections 298A and 298C, for example, are kind of designed to protect religious feelings of Muslims. And I think this is part of the key reason why they've been able to be misused to the extent that they have been. And then the third argument is that the Zia regime criminalized groups it considered to be a threat to its authority. The British did the very same through things like the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, through its kind of pseudo-scientific language of tribes that were apparently addicted to committing certain offences. And this is, I would say, comparable to the Zia regime's criminalisation of the Ahmadiyya through sections 298B and 298C. And he would make, like Maududi, kind of sweeping generalisations about the whole community regarding their intentions and loyalties to Pakistan.
Right. My own position on blasphemy laws in Pakistan is more historic. I'm just sharing my idea. It's most historicized compared to the colonialism context. I wrote a few essays for Dawn I think, of course, colonial structures also had these kind of like oppressive laws, or what they call for the sake of maintaining stability or harmony in diverse societies. However, I think it goes back to the 12th, 13th century, and then how Islam was interpreted at that time. The role of Ghazali, who openly declared some philosophers, Muslim philosophers, apostates and punishable by death. So, and I think the modern justifications for blasphemy laws in Muslim majority countries is derived generally from those kind of Muslim or Islamic intellectual history. And of course, colonialism played a role. I'm not downplaying the role of the colonialism, of course, but yeah, anyhow. Do you want to comment on that if you want to?
I think it's really complicated because obviously the blasphemy laws in the context of Pakistan are directly from those British colonial era laws. So I think you've got the blasphemy on the one hand that came from Britain and came from Christianity. And then obviously, as you say, in the context of Islam, it's quite complicated. My background's obviously more in Judeo-Christian theology, so I'm playing catch up a bit with Islamic theology. But ultimately, I understand that there's that disconnect and tension between the Quran, the message of the Quran, and the message of a hadith, and deciding which ones are authentic and which ones are not. And then obviously the added influence of philosophers and Islamic scholars, like you mentioned, over the millennia as well. So it's really complicated to decide how Islam is actually defined in terms of these issues, which is the primary source that we go to. Obviously, having been educated as a theologian, my initial response is to say, well, it's the Quran is the ultimate authority to go back to. And so I think I ultimately suggest that this is colonial, because to me, this sort of blasphemy is kind of alien to Islam, in my opinion, originally speaking, because the verses on blasphemy, so-called blasphemy in the Quran kind of suggest that you should not sit with a person who insults your religion, and then just
this is the only thing to do. Yeah, just don't
exactly.
Yeah,
until they change the topic of conversation. So for
which
me,
is cool. I really like it.
Exactly. It's what you would do to if it happened to you. Right. Anyway. So
I think there is a similar suggestion for other things, that if you come across ill speech, ignore it with dignity.
Exactly. My general understanding of Islam, because I did read the whole Quran during Ramadan, I think it was last year, and my general feeling is that most of it is taking the moral high ground, and I think that's a general good, principle to live by generally anyway, whether you're Muslim or not. So I think that's partly what influenced my decision to kind of focus more on the colonial side of it, in addition to the fact that it just has a colonial heritage, the actual laws themselves, and the language. Specifically, the fact that Zia decided to use that colonial era language of hurt religious feelings, which again, I wouldn't see in the Quran, I think. So
right. We may disagree on the colonial or pre-colonial thing, but we definitely agree that Zia was someone who actually further complicated it.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely agree with that.
Right. So, like, as you talked about Quran and everything, you mentioned early on in your thesis and in this discussion that you take a theological approach. What does it mean? Like, what is the theological approach?
Yeah, so obviously it's tricky in this context, because obviously I think theology kind of relates to all aspects of life. So I think when you're approaching a topic like this, you're also, if you're approaching it from a theological lens, you're also approaching it from a historical, legal, political lens. But as I kind of suggested, I was ultimately trying to move away from that security lens. And I often felt that theology was kind of relegated in scholarship about Pakistan, which seems surprising considering how important religion is in kind of both extremism and in the political landscape as well. Ultimately, Pakistan is an Islamic republic. The constitution refers to God's sovereignty and the importance of Islamic injunctions. So it felt like a natural lens to approach the country from. Additionally, as I said, scholars have kind of asserted that Maududi influenced some aspects of Islamization before and under Zia without substantiating those claims. So the initial reason why I focused on Maududi was to kind of test these assertions, which involved reading Maududi's works in a great detail to kind of understand the ideas behind them. And ultimately, all of these works of his stem from the fact that he was a Muslim and he believed in the message of the Quran. So if other scholars before me who were from other disciplines had decided to read Maududi's works, in their entirety, then they would have found the fact that the Zia regime plagiarized Maududi's work, before. So I think without studying Maududi's theological works, we'd kind of lack that evidence about the comprehensive influence that he had over the Zia regime, but also that kind of theological reasoning behind Zia's Islamization efforts, which were not always kind of self-evident. So there are kind of like two key examples of my theological approach in my thesis, which I'd probably highlight. So the first is, again, understanding the idea in the Objectives Resolution that Pakistan's elected representatives must act within God's limits. So this issue in the clause of the Objectives Resolution was highlighted by religious minority members of the Constituent Assembly who were kind of objecting to its inclusion because they couldn't actually understand its meaning and significance. And obviously a constitutional preamble be accessible to all people regardless of whether they're Muslim or not. And one of the members, Bhupendra Datta, he actually objected to the inclusion of the clause and suggested that the phrase implied that a man could go beyond the wishes of God. So he was making a theological argument that no Muslim would actually admit that humans were able to go beyond the limits of God. But ultimately, if you contextualize this within Maududi's ideas, you can understand that that's a kind of misunderstanding of the concept in Islamic theology. So this is a kind of a theological approach in the sense that I take the Arabic word for limits in the Quran, which is hududu, and when you look at its use within the Quran, then you can see that it relates to kind of social behavior. So particularly marriage, divorce, inheritance. So the limits are the boundaries that God has given to humanity to kind of not overstep in order to be just in our relationships with other people. So dictating the rights of people in kind of particular circumstances. And obviously hudud in the context of Zia is more commonly associated with the hudud ordinance, which introduced Islamic laws and punishments for certain crimes and prohibition. So Maududi likewise referred to the act of lawmaking and governing as set within God's limits, such that overstepping them means that the leader loses confidence of the people and creates chaos and conflict in society. Thus, it's only by actually digging into the theological significance of the term that its use can kind of be understood in the context of the Objectives Resolution. Another member of the Constituent Assembly at the time, Dr. Ishtiaq Hussain Qureshi, defended the Objectives Resolution by arguing that actually remaining within the limits provided by God protects minorities because it prevents the misuse of power. And this was a view obviously shared by Maududi as well.
Maududi, yes.
Yeah. So a second kind of key example of this theological approach is the contextualization of the criminalization and declaration of Ahmadis as non-Muslims within Maududi's understanding of the Islamic State. So Maududi wrote a pamphlet called Rights of Non-Muslims in Islamic State. And this was actually based on his response to a questionnaire by the Constituent Assembly in August 1948 about what the position of minorities should be in Pakistan. So Maududi suggested that the Islamic State classifies people into Muslims and non-Muslims according to their belief in Islam or lack of belief. as the ideology of the state. So he believed, and I quote, that the establishment of an ideological Islamic state is the greatest guarantee for non-Muslims in Pakistan, end quote. So on openly distinguishing between Muslims and non-Muslims, he envisaged specific rights that are guaranteed for non-Muslims, which included being made subject to their own religious law and having full religious freedom to practice in their own towns. But Maududi also believed that non-Muslims couldn't occupy key government posts because they didn't subscribe to the ideology of the state, and nor would they be expected to join the army in defense of that ideology. And this is really key because when you look at his demands against the Ahmadiyya in the original riots that occurred in 1953, when the first attempt occurred to declare Ahmadis non-Muslims, his demands, as were that of the other ulama, was to remove Sir Zafar-ullah Khan and other Ahmadis from key posts. And also, so that is obviously inherently connected to Maududi's belief about what the role of non-Muslims would be in Islamic State. So then you can understand why certain modern anti-Ahmadi figures oppose the presence of Ahmadis in the army, which continue to be made. I think one member of parliament made it in parliament a few years ago. So it's these sort of arguments, theological arguments, that kind of underpin Zia's criminalization of the Ahmadiyya in 1984, which I think is really important in this context.
Yeah, very interesting. But I have a question. I think Maududi also talks about, it reminds me of Humaira Iqtidar's work, that Muslims who do not subscribe to the ideology of the Islamic State shall be treated as politically non-Muslims, some kind of this idea that if you are not required to subscribe to the ideology of Islam, the state, if you are Muslim, you can choose to not subscribe to the state's ideology if you want to.
I think that's interesting. I think it probably depends, obviously, what the ideology is. I think as far as I understand it, Maududi believes that Muslims would have to follow the ideology if the state was Islamic. But obviously, if it's a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim state, then obviously the expectation is different, that they would respect the rule that they're under, but that they would have separate ideology. So I think that's why he made what were seen as quite surprising statements about the Muslim minority in India, who I think probably felt quite left behind, because he was basically saying, well, under Islam, you can be ruled by a non-Muslim power and you kind of have to respect that. So I think it's kind of complicated, but ultimately I think his position depends on whether it's the ideology is Islamic or not.
Right. Coming forward to the 21st century. Now, Zia is no more here, but the past is not dead. We are in the 21st century. There is Jamaat Islami, Maududis Jamaat, and then there is also now TLP, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan. My question is, how are those developments in terms of cultural discourse, political and legal developments, how, as an academic, you see that those developments continue to shape cultural imagination and political and institutional setups in Pakistan?
Yeah, so I'll focus specifically on kind of the discourses that are still ongoing about minorities that have been influenced by Zia's Islamization. So in terms of the political discourse, the Zia regime placed its nondescript Islamic ideology at the heart of the offices of Pakistan's political system. So if you look within the constitution today, all political oaths of office, which are at the end, includes this declaration, which states, "I will strive to preserve the Islamic ideology, which is the basis for the creation of Pakistan," end quote, which obviously I've tried to problematize that by saying, firstly, what is the Islamic ideology? And secondly, the Zia didn't agree with Jinnah, I think, on what the basis of Pakistan was. So this phrase was actually used by Zia as part of the oath that had to be taken by nominees to be part of the newly established Majlis-e-Shura in 1981. So that's an example of the kind of political discourse in relation to the Islamic ideology. But this sort of language is also significant in terms of the Zia regime's impact on cultural discourses. So, for example, there was quite a contentious letter that the Higher Education Commission wrote in June last year, or I think it was last year, which called on higher education institutions to distance themselves from activities like the Hindu festival of Holi, described as incompatible with the country's identity and ideology.
I saw it somewhere.
Yeah. So these kind of enthusiastic celebrations of religious minority festivals were portrayed as contradictory to Pakistan's ideology and Islamic identity. So you can see how it's sometimes that language is employed to in such a way that kind of distances religious minorities from the identity, the national identity of Pakistan. And there's also remains some kind of religious segregation within the education system, as far as I'm aware. So, and that's in keeping with Zia's regime's kind of policies. So, as mentioned, Zia made Islamic and Pakistan studies compulsory at the bachelor's level in some universities. But actually, the non-Muslims could opt for ethics and Pakistan studies instead. And I think in its own right, you know, the implications of non-Muslims having to study ethics is probably quite problematic of itself. But obviously, under the single national curriculum that was launched by Imran Khan's government, Muslim students would be taught Islamiyat from grades 1 through to 12. So while religious minority students would be taught religious studies, Muslim students would be taught separately about Islam. And ultimately, I think that's a key obstacle to interfaith harmony in Pakistan, because students, I believe, should be kind of taught all major religions and together to have those kind of discussions and kind of rid any sense of othering between people of different religious affiliations. Obviously, we'll have to see to what extent this single national curriculum is going to be established. But if it continues like that, then I think that's quite problematic and can be related to the Zia regime. And then in terms of constitutional discourses, one of the most significant legacies of the Zia regime was the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution in 1985 for many reasons. Article 270A validated all of the ordinances and orders that Zia had made prior to the revival of the Constitution. So basically, July 1977 through to November 1985, all of those orders and ordinances made during that time. And it prevented them from being questioned in any court, which includes those 4 out of 5 offences relating to religion. And those who have since sought to kind of repeal those offences have faced threats, intimidation, and even assassination, which kind of reflects how integral these laws are now held in Pakistan. And the so-called blasphemy issue has become central to, as you mentioned, the previously banned Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan. It's the main kind of platform on which it's based. And members of the TLP are regularly involved in violence against minorities who are accused of blasphemy, particularly the sections that concern desecration of the Quran and insults of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So this has kind of created an extrajudicial air of untouchability around offences relating to religion that have been added under the Zia regime. And then finally, while it was the Bhutto government that actually declared Ahmadis non-Muslims through the constitution in 1974, defining a non-Muslim as a person who does not believe in the absolute and unqualified finality of Muhammad's prophethood, peace be upon him, it was actually Zia that Muslim became constitutionally defined as a person who believed in God, but also in the an unqualified finality of Muhammad's prophethood, peace be upon him. And so it was actually Zia that ensured that Pakistani Muslimness became defined by belief in Hatami Nabuwat, with the purpose of kind of excluding Ahmadis. So this naturally kind of enables further anti-Ahmadi sentiment in such a way that it's kind of presented as a matter of loyalty to the identity and ideology of the state. And it was kind of in my final chapter that I focus on how the criminalization of Ahmadiyya has had direct and lasting indirect impacts, which are very varied, but ultimately include a lot of extrajudicial violence against the community, violence against their graves and places of worship, and kind of new interpretations of what it means to pose as a Muslim, such that they can't engage in Kabani, as we saw with the detentions before Eid. And also they can't have minarets and domes because they're considered Islamic motifs on masjids. So so the lasting impact has been large, and I think that was something that maybe hadn't been talked about to a great extent, specifically in relation to the Zias Islamization of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mary. I have some other questions that are related to your research, but in a non-academic way. So you recently visited Pakistan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want, you can answer these questions in Urdu, but there is no pressure. So how was your experience in Pakistan? I am asking this question from a standpoint because when we go to different societies, we all experience some kind of cultural shocks. So was there any cultural shock? And how was your experience in Pakistan?
Pakistan's Zawudasta. But no, it was amazing because I think, unlike a lot of people who would visit Pakistan for the first time, I had this kind of wealth of knowledge that I've sort of developed over the last few years. So it kind of felt, I kind of developed a great love for the country without having actually ever been there. So it was quite surreal to actually go there in the end. Unfortunately, it was kind of primarily focused around Islamabad, so I didn't get to see a great diversity of the country, but I'm hoping to on my next trip. But I was able to kind of go to some historical sites, go to the famous Faisal Masjid, kind of all the main tourist sites in the capital, made it up to Murray. And I went to kind of Taxila and to look at the kind of Greek and Jain and Buddhist influences on Pakistan, which also don't get talked about very much, which I think they should. So I got to see quite a great deal in just a week or so. But I also got to try a lot of food, and I love Pakistani food. So
what's your favorite food? Do you remember anything like favorite food? Biryani.
I really like biryani. And also barbecue. I had quite a great deal of barbecue, and that was really tasty. So I enjoyed that a lot. I also like just simple, nashta, like paratha and other things. Really good.
You got that nashta in Islamabad?
I think yes, that was in Islamabad, and then once in Pindi as well. But
so have you been to a food street there? Like there is a food street. How was that experience?
It was really good. It was good. And I think I tried about 6 different types of chai while I was in Pakistan as well, because I really like chai now. So,
it's a national drink almost, right? Chai.
Yeah, exactly. It's much better than British tea, which I always offend my.
Thank you. That is a compliment.
By saying that, but it's true. So I felt like it was a long time coming, and I really enjoyed it. And as I say, I'm just hoping to see more of the country and more of the people and culture when I come next time. So
right. You haven't visited Lahore yet.
That's the top of my list. That's definitely the top of my list.
Of course, I kind of feel I'm biased, but because I studied and I stayed in Lahore, I kind of feel that Lahore is more important in terms of cultural understanding than Islamabad.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, in terms of food, Lahore is the top. Makes sense,
Okay,
So did you learn how to make that tea, like Pakistani chai?
I want to kind of practice that. I mainly like focused on learning how to like cook biryani properly. So this second time I actually made it only yesterday, and it's making it with the meat on the bone, which I've been told is the key to the richness.
Very important cultural nuance. Yes.
So yeah, so first time I did it without, and second time I did it on the bone, and it did taste a lot better. So I've taken that advice on board. But yeah, so definitely need to learn to make chai properly as well.
Yeah, I'm also teaching here some of my American friends how to make Pakistani chai. And I am like I'm very strict like when it comes to the protocols of chai. How you make chai, you just like don't destroy the very idea, because I'm sure you would have seen that chai is a concept, like it means you sit together, you discuss something, and then it's not like
Yeah,
American idea of coffee, like you go to Starbucks, you buy coffee and you just go away, right?
yeah.
So
I think it's like the institution of the pubs, I'd say, in the UK. It's kind of the similar like hub of like socializing and
right.
community. Yeah. So I can definitely understand that and the seriousness with which it's treated.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Mary. I am really looking forward that you get this thesis published as a book, and I really admire your work. I have been following your work for like more than a year now. I'm telling viewers know that Mary writes on Pakistan's important issues, particularly related to my area of interest. I study religion and in politics, and she has been a wonderful source of information. She comes up with intriguing, provocative perspectives. So do read, and your thesis is publicly available, right?
Yes, yeah, it's publicly available, so that can just be searched on Google and downloaded.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.